The courtroom buzzed with the quiet hum of anticipation as Judge Marissa Lee walked in her steps, echoing on the polished floor, her calm presence immediately commanding attention and respect. She was a woman who had worked tirelessly to earn her place in a system that had once overlooked her and others. Like her now, she was a symbol of authority and wisdom, and today she would face a challenge unlike any before. She surveyed the room as her eyes flicked over the jury, the defense team, the prosecutor, and finally to the witness stand where Officer Ryan Thompson stood tall, his uniform pressed, and his expression one of cool indifference. He was no stranger to authority, but there was something in the air today that made him uneasy. It was the presence of Judge Lee. Her reputation preceded her. She was known for being sharp, focused, and unwavering. But more than that, she had a quiet power that could silence even the loudest voices in the room. Today, the case before them was one that had garnered public attention, an incident involving Officer Thompson, accused of using excessive force during an arrest. The details were still unfolding, but the implications were clear. There was tension in the courtroom, and the stakes were high. The case was set to determine not just the fate of one officer, but the broader questions of justice and accountability that lingered in the air for far too long. As Judge Lee settled into her chair, the room fell into a hush. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her mere presence was enough to command silence, and the people in the room knew better than to challenge it. She glanced briefly at the file in front of her before looking at Officer Thompson. He was sitting in a confident posture, clearly feeling secure in his position. As a law enforcement officer, he had faced tough questioning before, but there was something different about the way Judge Lee looked at him. It wasn't the same as others, who might have been intimidated by his uniform and title. No, she had the air of someone who had been in control for years, someone who knew exactly what to expect from him and what he was trying to hide. The first few minutes of the testimony went by without incident. The questions were standard, and the answers even more so. Officer Thompson described the events of the arrest with a sense of detachment, as if recounting a mundane task. He spoke about the suspect with cold efficiency and offered his side of the story with a sense of pride in his actions. But as the questioning continued, Judge Lee began to press harder. Her questions focused not just on the events themselves, but on his decisions, the ones that had led to the use of force. As she asked about the moments leading up to the arrest, his tone shifted slightly, no longer so confident, but still dismissive. The way he answered seemed to suggest that his actions were justified simply because he wore a badge. And that was when it began, the subtle shift in the room. As the tension built quietly, everyone could feel it, even if they couldn't name it. The officer's dismissive attitude was starting to take root, and everyone began to sense that something was about to change. As the questioning continued, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavier with each passing moment. Judge Lee's sharp eyes never left Officer Thompson, her questions becoming more pointed, more deliberate. The officer's responses began to show cracks in his previously unshakable confidence. He seemed increasingly agitated as he struggled to maintain his composure. His voice was still firm, but his words lacked conviction, the arrogance that had initially filled the room beginning to waver. Judge Lee's questions were simple but direct, and each one seemed to peel away at the layers of self-assuredness the officer had wrapped around himself. Thompson shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping on the edge of the witness stand. He could feel the eyes of the room on him, waiting for him to answer in a way that would justify his actions. But the more he spoke, the less certain he became. Judge Lee, however, remained still, unflinching in her gaze, her calm presence never wavering. It was clear that she was not intimidated by his uniform, not swayed by his status as a law enforcement officer. She wasn't interested in his badge or his title. She was interested in the truth. The officer's discomfort didn't go unnoticed by the rest of the courtroom. Members of the jury shifted in their seats, exchanging subtle glances. They could sense that the officer was no longer in control, that the questions were beginning to expose the cracks in his story. Even the defense attorney, who had been leaning forward in his chair, now sat back, his expression betraying a hint of uncertainty. The prosecutor, too, was watching closely, knowing that Judge Lee was in complete control of the situation. As Judge Lee continued to ask her questions, she pressed him on the use of force during the arrest. She asked him to explain why he had resorted to physical force when other options had been available. Officer Thompson's responses grew more defensive, his voice rising ever so slightly, though he was careful to maintain an air of professionalism. But it was evident to anyone watching that his patience was beginning to wear thin. His answers became more dismissive, more curt. He answered as though the question itself was beneath him, as though Judge Lee's challenge was an insult to his authority. It was then that the tension in the room reached a boiling point. Judge Lee asked a pointed question about the officer's approach to de-escalation during the arrest, inquiring if he had considered any alternatives before using force. The officer scoffed and, in a quiet mutter, but just loud enough for the people closest to the bench to hear, he said, "She's just trying to make me look bad." The words were careless, almost dismissive of the court's authority, and they hung in the air like a challenge. A hush fell over the room. For a brief moment, it seemed as if time itself had frozen. Even the most seasoned members of the courtroom were taken aback. The officer had crossed the line. He had disrespected not just Judge Lee, but the very space in which justice was meant to be served. The defense attorney looked stunned, his lips pressing into a thin line. The prosecutor's eyebrows furrowed, and the jury leaned forward in their seats, sensing that something was about to happen. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Everyone knew that Judge Lee would not let this pass, not under any circumstances. And they were right. Judge Lee's response would not only define the rest of the trial, but would send a clear message to everyone in the room about the kind of justice she would uphold. The room seemed to hold its breath as the officer's muttered words lingered in the air. A collective silence descended over the courtroom, thick and heavy with anticipation. Everyone could feel it, the undeniable shift that had just occurred. Officer Thompson had crossed the line, and the gravity of his words hung like a cloud. For a moment, even the most seasoned court officers and legal professionals didn't know how to respond. It was as if the entire room had collectively realized that this was no ordinary trial. It was a test of respect, authority, and justice itself. Judge Lee, however, didn't flinch. She didn't even move. Her calm demeanor was almost unnerving in its stillness. Her eyes were fixed firmly on Officer Thompson, her gaze piercing, steady, and unblinking. For a heartbeat, the officer sat there, unaware of how to navigate the moment he had just created. His expression faltered, a brief flash of guilt flickering across his face, but he quickly masked it with a forced look of nonchalance. He seemed to believe he could simply shrug off his remark, as if no one had heard it. But Judge Lee was different. She wasn't about to let it slide. The judge's voice broke the silence. It was measured and calm, but there was no mistaking the authority behind it. "Officer Thompson," she began, her voice cool but sharp, "I have asked you a simple question, and you have chosen to respond with disrespect." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing, "You may have the power to arrest individuals, but you do not have the right to undermine the integrity of this courtroom, nor do you have the privilege to dismiss the seriousness of these proceedings." Her words cut through the room, and it was clear that she wasn't merely reprimanding him for his comment. She was taking control of the situation, reasserting the respect and order that the officer had attempted to disrupt. The air in the room crackled with an electric charge, the audience now fully aware of what was happening. The tension had reached a boiling point, and Judge Lee's measured response only added to the intensity. She wasn't angry, but the force of her words left no room for misinterpretation. This was a matter of principle, not emotion. Officer Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw tightening, his earlier bravado now replaced with a visible unease. His hand moved to adjust his collar, his fingers fidgeting in nervousness. It was clear that his confidence had evaporated. He had underestimated the strength of the woman sitting in front of him, and now he was forced to reckon with the reality of his actions. The room waited in stunned silence, and for the first time in this trial, Officer Thompson realized that his words would not go unchallenged. The judge's eyes never left him as she spoke again, this time with even more authority. "This courtroom is a place where all people, no matter their background, no matter their title, are expected to show respect. Your role as an officer does not exempt you from this basic standard." Her words were not a simple rebuke but a declaration, a reminder that in her courtroom, the law and its principles were above all else, and no one, not even those who wore a badge, was above the law. The officer opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to apologize or to explain, but Judge Lee held up her hand, silencing him before he could get another word out. "I suggest you rethink your attitude and remember that your actions are under scrutiny," she said firmly, her tone leaving no room for further debate. "You are here to answer questions, not to undermine this court." In the quiet that followed, the room seemed to breathe again, the weight of the moment settling over everyone like a heavy cloak. The officer, now visibly shaken, nodded curtly, his earlier defiance replaced with a semblance of humility. But it was clear that the dynamic in the courtroom had shifted. The power had swung back to Judge Lee, and the respect she commanded was undeniable. The silence in the courtroom stretched on, thick and palpable, as Judge Lee's words hung in the air like a weight that no one dared to lift. Officer Thompson's discomfort was evident, his earlier confidence shattered like glass. He glanced down at his hands, fidgeting with his fingers as if trying to gather his thoughts, but nothing seemed to come. The room, once tense and uncertain, now buzzed with a quiet reverence for the judge. The jury, whose eyes had been flicking back and forth between the two, now focused intently on Judge Lee. The power had shifted, and it was clear that they were witnessing something far more significant than just a court case. It was a moment of authority, justice, and principle. Judge Lee maintained her steady composure, her eyes unwavering from Officer Thompson. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even loud. Her strength came from her stillness, her ability to remain unshaken by the officer's earlier remarks. She had long learned that true authority wasn't about shouting, it was about standing firm, about commanding respect without demanding it. Her voice broke the silence once more, not with fury, but with an unyielding calm that resonated throughout the courtroom. "Officer Thompson," she began, her voice even and measured, "you have just demonstrated a serious lapse in judgment. This is not a place for posturing, nor is it a place where individuals with power can undermine the principles of fairness and respect. I am here to ensure that justice is served, not for anyone to make this about ego or pride." She paused, her gaze unrelenting, and for the first time in the trial, the officer looked truly flustered. The steely gaze of Judge Lee had pierced through his veneer of confidence, and he was now visibly uncomfortable. The audience could sense the shift in the room. The defense attorney, who had been watching carefully, looked between the judge and the officer, his brow furrowing as if he were calculating the consequences of what had just transpired. The prosecutor, too, seemed more alert now, her posture more rigid as if ready for the next phase of the trial. The jury had grown more attentive as well, sensing that the judge's intervention wasn't just about reprimanding the officer. It was about ensuring that the principles of justice would not be undermined by anyone, regardless of their position. With a deep breath, Judge Lee continued, her voice unwavering. "I do not care about your status as a law enforcement officer, nor do I care about your previous successes. What I care about is the truth and the manner in which you conduct yourself in this court." She shifted slightly, her eyes now sweeping across the room, her presence commanding the attention of everyone in it. "I will not allow you or anyone else to diminish the importance of this case. You are here to answer questions, not to belittle the process. I will not tolerate any further disrespect." The weight of her words hung in the room, leaving an impression that would not soon be forgotten. The officer, his earlier bravado completely gone, sat straighter now, his face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and frustration. He had no retort, no argument left to make. It was clear that he had overplayed his hand, and now the reality of his situation was setting in. He had just been called out in front of the very people he had assumed would back him without question. Judge Lee's gaze softened just slightly, but her authority remained. "Now," she said, turning her attention back to the matter at hand, "I will ask you again. Explain why you chose to escalate the situation rather than de-escalate it. What led you to the decision to use force in that moment?" There was no answer at first. Officer Thompson hesitated, his eyes flickering to the floor as if trying to gather his thoughts. The room watched in quiet anticipation. It was clear now that this was no longer just about the events of one arrest. It was about accountability, integrity, and the responsibility that came with wearing a badge. As the officer finally opened his mouth to speak, there was a subtle shift in the room. It wasn't just about a case anymore. It was a turning point, one that everyone in the courtroom would remember. For a few moments, the courtroom remained frozen in an uneasy silence. Officer Thompson opened his mouth, but no words came out. It was as though the weight of Judge Lee's words had pressed the air from his lungs. The eyes of the jury were on him, each member of the panel keenly aware that something critical was unfolding before them. The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing nervously at the officer, while the prosecutor seemed to hold her breath, waiting for Thompson's next move. Even the court reporters had paused, their fingers hovering over the keys, ready to capture whatever would happen next. The only sound in the room was the faint rustling of papers as the judge shuffled her notes, her gaze still locked on the officer. Officer Thompson cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of composure. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his posture betraying the tension running through his body. He had been an officer for years, trained to handle high-stakes situations with a sense of control and authority. Yet now, in front of a judge who had made it clear that she would not tolerate anything less than full respect, he found himself scrambling to find the right words. I, Thompson stammered, his voice faltering. He paused, then took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for the next round of questioning. I felt that the situation was escalating, he finally said, his voice regaining a little strength, though it lacked the certainty it once held. I didn't feel I had a choice but to take control of the suspect. He was becoming combative, and I needed to ensure the safety of everyone involved. Judge Lee didn't blink, her eyes unwavering as she listened. She didn't immediately respond, but instead took a moment to let his words settle. The entire courtroom could sense that this was not a simple matter. The judge had heard stories like this before. She had listened to similar justifications for excessive force in the past, many of them made by officers who were unwilling to acknowledge the flaws in their approach. But Judge Lee wasn't interested in justifications. She was interested in the truth. Officer Thompson, she said, her voice low but authoritative, I understand that law enforcement can be a dangerous profession. I understand that situations can escalate quickly. But I ask you this, did you give any thought to de-escalating the situation? To using alternative methods to bring about control? Or did you simply decide that force was the quickest and easiest solution? There it was, the question that would expose the heart of the matter. Thompson's hand twitched slightly, his fingers drumming nervously against the wooden surface of the witness stand. His confidence, which had initially been so apparent, was now replaced by a growing discomfort. For the first time in his career, he was being asked to justify his actions in a way that made him feel vulnerable, forced to confront the very decisions he had made in that moment. The certainty that he had been in the right was slipping away with every word Judge Lee spoke. I did try to talk to him, Thompson said, his voice quieter now. But the suspect wasn't listening. He was acting erratically, and when he made a move toward me, I had to act quickly. Judge Lee didn't let him off the hook. A move toward you, she repeated, leaning slightly forward. What kind of move? And how do you know it was an immediate threat to your safety? Did you consider backing away? Did you attempt to give him a chance to comply? Thompson shifted again, now visibly uncomfortable. He knew that Judge Lee wasn't just asking questions, she was challenging the very foundation of his actions. And with each question, he could feel his position weakening. The room seemed to close in around him, and the cold weight of accountability settled over his shoulders like a mantle he hadn't expected. His voice cracked as he answered, I didn't have time to think about it. I had to protect myself. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she allowed the silence to stretch as though she were weighing his words carefully. Then finally, she spoke, her tone still calm, but with an unmistakable edge. No, she said firmly. You didn't have time to think about it. But that's the problem, Officer Thompson. You didn't think at all. She paused, letting the words linger in the air. You chose the quickest route, the easiest path. And now, we all have to deal with the consequences. The words stung. Everyone in the courtroom could feel the weight of them. Thompson's head drooped, his defiance now gone. He had no answer, no defense. The trial, which had started as a simple legal proceeding, had transformed into something far more profound. It was now about accountability, about responsibility, and about the difficult choices that every officer must face in the line of duty. The courtroom was thick with tension as Judge Lee's words echoed in the space, reverberating through the minds of everyone present. Officer Thompson had no response, no words to defend himself. He could feel the weight of her accusation hanging over him, the truth of her statement cutting deeper than any cross-examination could. He had been trained to respond quickly, to act when faced with danger, but the truth was that he hadn't thought deeply enough in that moment. And now, in front of the judge and everyone else, that lapse in judgment was exposed for all to see. Judge Lee didn't look away. She kept her gaze fixed on the officer, waiting for him to come to terms with what had just transpired. There was no sympathy in her eyes, only an unwavering commitment to justice. She knew that the officer's actions weren't just about this single incident. They were a part of a larger pattern, a broader issue of how power was wielded by those entrusted with it. She wasn't interested in excuses. She was interested in truth. And the truth was that Officer Thompson had made a choice. He had chosen to use force instead of trying to de-escalate the situation, and now that decision had consequences. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. The jury watched, their faces a mix of curiosity and uncertainty, unsure of where this would go next. Even the defense attorney, who had once been so sure of his client's position, now sat motionless, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He knew that things had changed. The judge had found a crack in the officer's defense, and once that crack was exposed, it would be nearly impossible to ignore. Finally, Officer Thompson broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean for it to go this far," he muttered, his eyes dropping to the floor as if ashamed to meet anyone's gaze. His words were hesitant, almost as if he were speaking to himself rather than the judge or the courtroom. I thought I was doing the right thing." Judge Lee's expression softened, but only slightly. She could hear the remorse in his voice, but she didn't let that sway her. "Thought you were doing the right thing," she repeated, her voice steady. "But you didn't stop to question if it truly was the right thing. And that's where the problem lies, Officer Thompson. You acted impulsively, and now the consequences of that action are being felt by everyone involved. You're here today, not because of some unavoidable mistake, but because of a decision you made." Thompson's shoulders slumped, his body language now completely different from the man who had walked into this courtroom with a sense of entitlement. The proud stance, the arrogance, it was all gone. He looked broken, small, and for the first time in the trial, it seemed as though he understood the gravity of what was at stake. The room was eerily quiet. The jury, the spectators, the attorneys, all eyes were on Judge Lee and Officer Thompson. Everyone was waiting for the next move, the next word to fall. The prosecutor had already shifted in her seat, watching with a mix of anticipation and approval. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The officer's defense was crumbling, and Judge Lee had delivered the blow that might just turn the tide in favor of justice. Judge Lee finally broke the silence, her voice calm but resolute. "Officer Thompson," she said, "I want you to think very carefully about the decisions you make going forward, not just in this trial, but in your life. What you've done today is not just about what happened with that suspect. It's about accountability. It's about how we, as individuals who hold power, must always be aware of the impact our actions have on others." She paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. "This is not just a trial about one officer's actions. This is about the system, about the accountability of those who are entrusted with the safety and well-being of the public. You've made a choice, Officer Thompson, and now we must all deal with the consequences." Thompson sat there, his face a mixture of frustration, guilt, and confusion. He wanted to argue, to defend himself further, but the weight of Judge Lee's words had left him without any more justifications. The reality of the situation had become undeniable. He had failed to act with the restraint required of him. He had failed to uphold the responsibility that came with his badge. And as the silence stretched once more, it became clear to everyone in the room that this was more than just a courtroom exchange. It was a turning point, both for Officer Thompson and for the justice system itself. The message was clear: no one was above the law, and true justice required more than just following orders. It required reflection, responsibility, and a willingness to do what was right, even when it wasn't the easiest path to take. The tension in the courtroom had not dissipated. If anything, it had only grown heavier. Officer Thompson's shoulders sagged under the weight of Judge Lee's words, the reality of his actions settling in like an unbearable weight. He sat in silence, unable to meet the eyes of anyone around him, his gaze fixed on the floor as though it might offer some sort of escape. The judge's voice had pierced through his defenses, exposing the vulnerability he had long kept hidden beneath the uniform and the badge. It was clear that the officer's words had been hollow, a defense that lacked the depth to shield him from the truth. And now, the consequences were impossible to ignore. Judge Lee, however, remained calm and poised. Her purpose was not to break the officer further, but to make him understand the full scope of his responsibility. She was not here to humiliate him. She was here to hold him accountable, to remind him, and everyone in the courtroom, of the values that upheld the law. She had seen too many cases where authority figures had acted with impunity, assuming that their power would protect them from scrutiny. But she wasn't going to let that happen here. Not in her courtroom. For a brief moment, she glanced toward the jury, her eyes scanning their faces. She could see the impact of this exchange in their expressions. Some looked pensive, others troubled, but all were listening intently. This wasn't just about the officer's actions anymore. It was about the larger question of accountability and trust. Judge Lee had laid bare a truth that was hard to deny. That power, when abused, could destroy the very trust it was meant to protect. She turned her attention back to Officer Thompson. "I understand that being in law enforcement can be difficult," she began, her voice still measured but with a touch of empathy. "But that does not excuse actions that harm others. That does not excuse a failure to pause, to think, to choose restraint when the situation demands it." The officer's head remained lowered, but his hands clenched into fists. He seemed to be fighting against the shame rising in him. Judge Lee's words were like a mirror, reflecting not only his actions, but also the deeper failings within his approach to his work. In his mind, he had justified his choices by the need to act quickly, to maintain control, but now, in the face of the judge's logic, he could see the cracks in that rationale. He hadn't fought. He hadn't considered other options. He had chosen the path of force, and it had led him here, sitting in front of the very judge who held the power to change the course of his life. She continued, her tone softening, but not losing its clarity. "Every action has consequences, Officer Thompson. Your actions didn't just affect you. They affected a person's life, the safety of the community, and the integrity of the law itself. You must ask yourself, as a law enforcement officer, whether you are upholding the ideals of justice or whether you are merely wielding your power for your own sense of control." The courtroom was so still you could hear a pin drop. The reality of Judge Lee's words was sinking into everyone present. For the first time, Officer Thompson was being forced to confront his own shortcomings, not through the lens of his badge or his training, but through the lens of moral responsibility. The prosecutor, who had been watching closely, nodded slightly in agreement. This was exactly the kind of accountability she had hoped for. It wasn't about a verdict handed down in a single moment. It was about forcing individuals to look inward and understand the deeper consequences of their choices. Justice wasn't just about laws and punishments. It was about creating a system that held people accountable to higher standards. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Officer Thompson slowly lifted his head. His eyes, red-rimmed with shame, met Judge Lee's steady gaze. He had nothing left to say. His defense was gone. He understood now that the power he had once wielded so freely was not a shield. It was a responsibility. And with that responsibility came an obligation to act with thoughtfulness, to respect the dignity of others, and to remember that force should never be the first answer. Judge Lee didn't wait for him to speak. She knew that the silence would speak volumes. She had made her point. The rest of the court would take over from here. The officer's fate was now in the hands of the jury, but one thing was certain. This trial had become about more than just one officer's actions. It had become a testament to the need for reflection, the importance of integrity, and the necessity of holding those in power to account. Everyone in the courtroom knew they had witnessed something profound, a pivotal moment in which justice had not just been discussed, but had been forcefully asserted. The courtroom was hushed as the minutes stretched on, filled with a heavy, almost suffocating silence. Officer Thompson sat in his seat, his posture defeated, his hands still clenched into tight fists. Judge Lee had spoken with unrelenting clarity, and for the first time, he understood the full extent of what was at stake. His earlier bravado, his confidence in his actions, now seemed like a distant memory. What had once felt like a routine situation had now escalated into something far greater, a test of his integrity, his commitment to justice, and the very trust placed in him by the community. The jury, too, seemed to be absorbing the weight of the moment. Each juror sat motionless, their eyes fixed on Officer Thompson, who could no longer meet their gaze. This was no longer about legal technicalities. It was about character, about the choices that define a person, and about whether those in power would be held accountable for their actions. Judge Lee's gaze remained fixed on the officer for a few more seconds, as if waiting for him to find his own way out of the corner into which he had backed himself. But there was no escape. The moment for justifications had passed. He had no more words to offer, no way to deny the truth that had been laid bare before him. Then, breaking the silence, Judge Lee addressed the courtroom with a voice that resonated with quiet authority. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her eyes sweeping across the room, "you have heard the evidence, and you have witnessed the unfolding of this trial. Now, it is up to you to decide whether Officer Thompson's actions were justified, or if they were the result of a lapse in judgment that cannot be ignored." Her words hung in the air, and the weight of the decision before the jury was palpable. Each juror understood that this case was not just about determining the fate of a single officer. It was about sending a message that actions have consequences, that those who wear badges must be held to the same standards as anyone else, and that justice cannot be swayed by power or position. The stakes had never been higher. The defense attorney, who had sat in tense silence throughout Judge Lee's questioning, now stood up, attempting to regain some semblance of control. "Your Honor," he began, his voice lacking its earlier confidence, "we ask that you remember the officer's years of service and the difficult circumstances he faced in the moment. He did what he thought was necessary to ensure public safety." Judge Lee nodded, acknowledging the defense's position. "I understand the argument," she replied calmly, "but there is a difference between acting out of genuine concern for safety and acting out of fear, anger, or a desire to assert control. Justice is not about knee-jerk reactions. It is about measured, thoughtful decisions." With that, she turned back to the jury. "You must decide whether this officer's actions were an unfortunate mistake or something deeper. But in doing so, remember that we all have a responsibility to uphold the law with fairness, dignity, and respect for every individual." The jury members exchanged glances, some nodding in quiet agreement. They had already been thinking about the larger questions raised throughout the trial. Officer Thompson's actions had already been weighed against the standards expected of law enforcement, and they knew that their decision could not be made lightly. As the judge gave them their final instructions, Officer Thompson sat in the witness chair, his thoughts a whirl of regret. He had once believed that his badge would shield him from scrutiny, but now he knew better. The law was not a tool to wield at will. It was a responsibility to be honored, no matter how uncomfortable the truth might be. His eyes flickered briefly toward Judge Lee, who still sat with her calm, unwavering presence. She had not just been the judge of the case, she had been a guardian of justice, a symbol of what the law should stand for. The jurors filed out of the room, the doors closing with a heavy finality that seemed to echo throughout the courtroom. Officer Thompson was left to sit in the emptiness, waiting for what was to come, knowing that whatever the verdict, his life, his career, had been forever changed by the moment of truth that Judge Lee had forced him to face. Outside the courtroom, the media buzzed, eager for any update, but inside, there was nothing but silence. The final chapter was not yet written, but one thing was clear. Whatever happened next, the courtroom had witnessed something important, something that would resonate beyond this case and beyond this trial. Justice, in its purest form, had been upheld.